Part 3 of War, Empire, and Trade. We left off with one war. Which one was it now? We dealt with the War of the Spanish Succession, then the War of the Austrian Succession, and next up for us, yet another major conflict between Great Britain and France, this time on 3 continents, over power, colonies, and trade. Yes, you guessed it, the 7 Years' War. Why called that? Because it lasted 7 years, as you can see here. But this was a global, at least in the sense that it was fought on 3 continents, North America, Europe, and in India. At least that's where the large-scale operations took place. The war actually began in North America, where British and French colonies sort of butted up against each other, and the 2 countries butted up against each other. And that part of the war that took place there between the 2 colonial European powers is often in American history known as the French and Indian War. But Austria goes to war against Prussia to reverse losses in the previous war with France as an ally. So if we look at the 4 countries matched up yet again, also minus Russia yet again, we see something quite odd. Great Britain and France are opposed to each other. That part's not odd. But Prussia and Austria have now flip-flopped, one war apart, to the other side. And this, I think, is useful for making a point about 18th century warfare. And that is that, in some ways, this century's warfare in European history is unique in that the warfare was not ideological, really, in any way. It was very much strategic. So it wasn't about fighting for principles per se, though there's some rhetoric of that thrown in. This is mostly a series of cold, kind of calculated wars of strategy, wars of gamesmanship, and looking for the advantage of one country at the expense of another. Again, that kind of zero-sum game, and countries looking out for their national interests, their self-interest, their national defense. So it wasn't surprising to anybody at the time that Prussia and Austria flip-flopped from one war to the next. It's kind of the way things were done. Even in the previous century, say the major war that we've already mentioned of that century, the 30 Years' War, there was a lot more ideology in that. And when we get to the French Revolution and what happens after in the next 2 centuries following in European history, ideology will be the primary reason that countries go to war in Europe. So this century, in that way, was an aberration. But this was a gigantic war. As Robert Marx says, the 7 Years' War is important to the story of how, I don't know why there's a semicolon, is important to the story of how Britain became a cotton textile producing rather than importing country. For the British cotton textile industry to grow, it needed export markets, and there was a growing market in the New World because of its peculiar institution of slavery, plantations, and mercantilist trade restrictions. So once again, this war is very much connected to trade, commerce, and colonies and empire. In the middle of this war, one of the major engagements in India, one of the major victories for the British, came at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. And here is a good example of something we talked about earlier, and that is the British East India Company and its own somewhat private army, with its CEO, or the closest thing to that in those days, Robert Clive, the leading official in the East India Company, at least in India, commanded thousands of troops and defeated a much larger Indian force at this battle. But this was sort of the crucial battle between Britain and France in this part of the 7 Years' War, in this part of the world. The victory gave the company and Britain control over Bengal, major province, large region in India, and in a short time allowed them to control Bengal's tax revenue, which means Bengal's taxes that they normally collected for their own government, from their own people. Now the British government, or the East India Company, watched over by the British government, is collecting the people of Bengal's taxes for them and keeping them and using them as British revenue. So this is a pivotal event in British control of all of India, not just at the time, but into the future, as I'm sure you know, Great Britain would only take firmer and firmer hold of India and would eventually become kind of the key colony from the British perspective in their global empire. So Clive is a prime example of the nexus of war, empire, and trade, as he was sort of doing all these things basically at once. In the middle of the war also, same year as Plassey, we see the Battle of Rossbach and the solidification of Prussian power. And yep, Frederick the Great is still around for this war too, and he continues to carve out a military legend or legendary status for himself militarily. His genius on full display. As Tim Blanding says, one of the most decisive victories against the odds in military history. So quick and easy was the Prussian victory that most of the French infantry never even got a chance to fire their weapons. Prussian casualties were in the hundreds, French casualties close to 3,000, with about 5,000 more captured. Rossbach didn't win the war. Prussia still had major hurdles and obstacles, but it did manage to survive by fighting so effectively, along with assistance from their British allies, and Prussia did come out of the war clearly as one of the great powers of Europe. And I said that about the previous War of the Austrian Succession, but that was kind of step one. This is step two, and after yet again Frederick the Great's incredible victories here, Prussia is now firmly on the map as a top-tier power in Europe. The British leader who kind of masterminded or willed his country to victory was the Prime Minister William Pitt, Pitt the Elder. Why Pitt the Elder? Well, because there's a Pitt the Younger. Both of them, father and son, prime ministers. Pitt the Younger will come a little bit later on. Pitt the Younger, by the way, was 23 or 24, I think 23 when he became Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he was actually really good at it. But so was his father, though they had sort of different temperaments and different types of ability. But this guy put enormous energy and effort into the war. He was ambitious, egotistical, sort of very kind of loud, but he organized the resources of the British Empire in a way that helped to defeat France. So deployed 45,000 troops in Canada, helping to secure victory there, and in the long run allow Britain to acquire total control over French Canada, becoming a British colony from that point forward. Alan Taylor, American historian, in a book called American Colonies, said the British overwhelmed New France, the name of their colony in Canada, with sheer numbers of soldiers and sailors, warships, and cannon. In 1758, the Royal Navy won control of the Atlantic and devastated French shipping, reducing the reinforcements and supplies that reached New France. So Pitt's approach to the war, which was criticized heavily at the time by his political opponents in England, in the year of victories, vindicated 1759. And this included the capture of Quebec on that year, an amphibious assault led by James Wolfe, which captured Quebec, though Wolfe was mortally wounded, as was the French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, in the same battle, both of them killed. But this was the beginning of the end for French Canada. At right around the same time, same year, the Battle of Cobra Bay was kind of the equivalent at sea of the capture of Quebec on land. So the year of victories saw Pitt's strategy pay full dividends. And Alan Taylor goes on to say, Britain won the 7 Years' War because advanced financial institutions and abundant investment capital enabled the government to raise more money, than could the French and Spanish. By 1763, however, mounting taxes and national debt had become alarming. So, as I mentioned earlier in the class, and we'll get to more of this in a few minutes, the British oftentimes won their wars, and they're by this time fast becoming the #1 military as well as economic power in Europe. But it's by combining that military prowess with their economic, huge amount of wealth pouring in from the commercial revolution, and the ways that they kind of married the two together, that is often maybe the #1 explanation for explaining Britain's rise to the top militarily and otherwise. It's at least one of the major factors. The British had money, and they financed war extremely efficiently and effectively, and Pitt is a good example of this, putting that capacity to full use in the 7 Years' War. The Treaty of Paris, which ended the war, you can see from the map, it leaves it pretty clear the British won a substantial victory. They hadn't controlled much beyond kind of the eastern seaboard of the Atlantic colonies before that, but now they have all that territory in red, taken from the French. So the Treaty of Paris was pretty one-sided. Tim Planning, it was France that had been most damaged by the war. By seeking to wage war simultaneously at sea, in the colonies, and on the continent, France was defeated in all three theaters. However, after the Treaty of Paris, British America stretched from the Arctic to the Caribbean, which in some ways could be seen as a good thing, and the French exited the war, with a leaner and more effective empire, while Britain took on vast debts and expensive new responsibilities. In the next war, the French would have a modernized army and a bigger navy of better designed warships. He doesn't mean a bigger navy than the British, but bigger than the one they had, bigger than the one the French had in the previous war. A British citizen years after the war said, "What did Britain gain by the most glorious and successful war in which she ever engaged? An extent of empire we were equally unable to maintain, defend, or govern." And you may have guessed it already from the quotes and from when this is the war we're talking about, that it is the debt incurred in this rather expensive war, however successfully the British financed it, that caused the British to take the unprecedented step of taxing their colonists, at least internally, for the first time in those colonies' history, leading eventually to the American War of Independence, or the American Revolution, as we usually refer to it here, which from the European perspective was an ongoing global war between Britain and France. In fact, from once the French decided to enter the war and sign an alliance treaty with the United States, fighting against the British, British troop strength in the colonies fighting George Washington's Continental Army was basically reduced by about half, because the British freaked out when first the French and then the Spanish signed a treaty of alliance with the United States too, and felt we have to defend our global empire, and so they took troops out of Philadelphia and other places in the colonies and moved them to Jamaica, moved them to India, and so George Washington had a slightly easier time of it, because he was fighting only about half of the number of British troops after France and Spain get into the war than before. At the Battle of Chesapeake Bay, the French defeated the British in a 5-day naval battle, which is a pretty big knockdown dragout. The British weren't used to losing major sea battles like this, but France did have the second biggest and most powerful fleet after Britain, and we already know they beefed it up between the last war and this one. This battle set up the Battle of Yorktown by sweeping the British fleet from the coast and allowing George Washington's troops to surround Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, with no access to the sea after the French fleet defeated the British fleet there and scored the victory for George Washington and the American effort that within a number of months led the British Parliament or House of Commons to decide to stop the war, draw their troops, bring their troops home, and allow the Americans to achieve their independence. So the British finally just left, which was really the goal of Washington and the Americans all along. Not so much to defeat the British in pitched battles, set piece battles, though they did fight a lot of them and won some, but the main point, and Washington understood this clearly, correctly, is we don't have to win battles, we just have to outlast the British. If they go home and we are remaining, then we have our independence, and it doesn't matter how many battles we've won or lost. And Chesapeake Bay, followed by Yorktown, achieved that end. So Blenheim, Poltava, Rossbach as signs of things to come. Right, as already mentioned, I'm kind of summing up here. And increased tension and fear between the five major powers of Europe from this point going forward. And I ask rhetorically, I'm not going to answer it here, what do these events have to do with the 20th century, or how do they, in a sense, prefigure what you guys already know is coming in the 20th century? The commercial effects of all this on Europe were profound, although that was sort of happening even before many of these wars, but you can kind of look at that for yourself. One further story here, a guy called Thomas Pitt, nicknamed Diamond, is sometimes seen as the first nabob, as they were known. Nabobs were, it wasn't exactly a nice or a complimentary term, but it stuck. But nabobs were people that saw, Englishmen, that saw advantages, ability to get rich by working for the British East India Company in India. And then once they got there, instead of just relying on their sometimes rather meager or modest salary, started doing business deals and trade on the side, which would get them fired if they got caught. But if they made a lot of money in the meantime, it wouldn't matter. They didn't care if they got caught. And Thomas Pitt was one of those. He was able to, I forget how he came across it or took it, but he got a hold of a diamond, a gigantic diamond, which sold for the sum of 20,000 pounds, which today would be, a fortune. But it sold for over 5 times that much 15 years later, which helped seal the family fortune, as it says. And it was Thomas Diamond Pitt. He got the nickname because of the gigantic diamond that made the family rich and eventually famous. But the grandson, William Pitt the Elder, is the one that led the British in the 7 Years' War. And the great-grandson, Pitt the Younger, I mentioned, was the young... they started the prime ministership young. We'll get to him later on in the class. But considered today to be two of the greatest prime ministers in all of British history, and their grandfather and great-grandfather was a nabob. And what the nabobs tended to do, and this is what this guy did, was go make a fortune in India, either fairly or unfairly, justly or unjustly, and come back with that fortune and use it to buy property, large estate somewhere, and then sort of rise socially and politically by being a landed family, landed gentleman. So we see far-flung colonial empires as sort of the long-term result of this, and Europe would only kind of extend its control and dominance, oftentimes, of course, in violent and ugly ways, which we'll get to in another unit on this later on. Lastly, I want to talk about the square of power, as we see here. The square of power is a phrase coined by a Harvard historian, a Brit himself, Scott himself, but teaches at Harvard today. And in one of his books, he kind of coins this phrase. and it's sort of stuck in my mind. It's been around a little bit. But the British sort of put this together starting in the late 17th century, and certainly by the mid-18th century, 7 Years' War is a great example. It was sort of working kind of in full motion, kind of up to full speed. So the four corners of the square, it's not even exactly a square, close enough. Efficient taxation, mainly something called the excise tax, tax on certain types of goods bought in stores, although it was very kind of arbitrary. A solid government in mainly the House of Commons and Parliament, meaning relatively uncorrupt and relatively trustworthy. The Bank of England, Britain's national bank, though it was partially privately owned and partially government owned, and in the upper left corner, the national debt. And it's the upper left, the national debt, that I think is the key to understanding all of this. It's through creative use of debt that Britain, as I mentioned earlier, was able to outdo all the other European countries in financing war. Again, they were the richest country, but they tapped into their riches extremely well to connect the private wealth to the needed public revenue, particularly for warfare. So the British paid for war by taxing effectively, as you see in the upper right, but also by going into debt, which means selling government bonds. Debt is always bonds, bonds, bonds. Today in the United States, in the news, when you hear about the national deficit or debt, they almost never say it, but they're talking about bonds. But it's all U.S. Treasury bills of different denominations. That's what the debt is. And it was the British didn't invent the idea of government bonds. It probably came from northern Italy and then through Holland and into England. But they were the ones who did it on the largest scale and the most successfully in the end. So France tried to market bonds as well around the same time. So other countries tried to do it, but they couldn't do it as effectively as the British because they weren't as wealthy. In the French case, mainly because their government wasn't nearly as relatively free of corruption and as trustworthy as the British Parliament, House of Commons was. So these four things together sort of were potent. So they brought in taxes effectively. They had a parliament to watch over the collection of taxes and the national debt in a way that gave taxpayers and investors confidence that they weren't being ripped off, at least for the most part. And the national debt, the sale of bonds, a brilliant stroke if the public trusts your government, believes it's solid enough to pay back the principal plus the interest on the bonds. But national debt or sale of bonds, and I may have said this before in class, appears to have come from earlier centuries, kings, princes, taking out forced loans, which is always a funny term, but it means exactly what it says. The king would say to the public, "You're loaning me money. I'll pay you back, but you don't have a choice. You're loaning me money." And usually they would pay them back because they wouldn't want to have to face the possible repercussions if they didn't. It could be a revolution or something. But once in a while they didn't because they didn't have the money. They lost it. And somewhere along the line, someone or different people in different places came up with a brilliant idea, and brilliant it was, to sell bonds so that you didn't have to force someone to loan you money. They'd come to you. Right? If your government is solid, if it's going to pay back, if it's known to be so steady that it pays back on time, every time, all the time, right? The principal plus the interest, because you're doing this to make a profit. You're loaning money to the government and getting interest in return. You're sort of like a banker, right? If you buy a little bit of bonds, a small number of bonds, you're a little banker. If you're a super rich guy and you buy thousands of bonds, you're like a huge banker loaning money to the government. But it's in the interests of the purchasers of bonds if the government's solid, because they're going to get their money back plus interest and profit almost for sure. So it's in their interest, and it's because of self-interest then that they want to buy the bonds. You don't have to point a gun at them and take out a forced loan. They come running to you because it's a good deal for them. But your government and your economy, your ability to tax, all have to be effective, solid, and seen that way by the public, or it doesn't work. How does the Bank of England come into this? Keep in mind the Bank of England was founded in 1693 in the middle of the 9 Years or King William's War, and that's no coincidence. Remember, all of this stuff was sort of first put into place primarily to pay for war and outstrip opponents, other countries. Another example of the European state system, competitive finance here, competitive government finance to outdo everybody militarily, being able to pay for weapons and troops and a better military. But the Bank of England just made all this work even more smoothly in the following way. If there's no Bank of England and Britain goes to war, it's selling bonds all the time anyway, but it's having to rely to some degree on, again, businessmen, merchants, bankers, people in the professions buying small amounts of bonds, coming to them to buy bonds. But that's still a little time-consuming and a little inefficient if there's money kind of trickling in, coming from different sources, thousands of different sources, thousands of different buyers of bonds. But if you have a Bank of England that's got lots of money stuffed into it, as it did, then when the government, the British government, goes to war against, say, France, all it has to do is sort of walk next door to the Bank of England, knock on the door and say, hey, we need 50 billion. Okay, and the Bank of England writes out a check that minute, and a minute later, the government can start putting everything into motion to pay for the war. Start making orders for cannons and bullets and cannonballs and blankets and medicine and uniforms for the troops, and they're underway immediately. And then the Bank of England can take its own sweet time to market the bonds and sort of pay them back in installments and pay back the principal plus the interest over time. So the Bank of England doesn't fight the war, so it can now deal with the bonds. The government doesn't have to worry about that because it got its 50 billion from the bank up front. So it just makes the transaction and the ability to get money from private wealth into government coffers for military spending just that much quicker and more efficient. And eventually this whole system, the square of power, was used for other things besides war as well, as governments through the centuries takes on more more responsibilities. Thank you.